Greetings and salutations, friends. Let me tell you a tragic tale. A tale of the Brujah Clan. A tale of lost perfection, of a fall from grace, of degeneration and self-annihilation. For the Brujah of today are little more than pale, self-destructive shadows of what they once were. Driven, nay, bound, as they are by their blood, forced to always resist, to fight the status quo wherever they may see it and however they may see it. I place particular emphasis on that last part, because for the Brujah, resistance is not a choice. It is not something driven by a high ideal or motivated by a particular ideology. It is a compulsion, a pathological drive buried deep within their blood. They simply must fight. They simply must resist anything and everything. And whilst they would prefer to fight those who are outsiders to their clan, if given no other option, they will swiftly turn upon and tear down each other as well. And nothing exemplifies this better than the so-called Anarch Free State. It was created during the Anarch Revolution of 1943, where they overthrew the Camarilla Prince of Los Angeles. And over the course of 2 years, it spread up and down the US West Coast, until eventually the Anarch Free State stretched all the way from San Diego to San Jose. But eventually that expansion was halted by the Prince of San Francisco. The Anarchs then decided to dig in and protect what was theirs, preparing to receive a major counterattack by their enemies. A counterattack that never materialized. And so, bereft of an external enemy, the Anarch Free States soon descended into squabbling and petty street warfare, with the various factions within turning upon one another one after one. Even after having created their utopia, a place without governments, without states, without nations, the Anarchs still could not have peace. Even whilst bereft of the usual status quo, they simply decided that the new status quo was the Anarch Free States. The various gangs, the various factions, the various organizations within it became the new evil. The new thing that they simply had to resist. Because after all, utopia is always just one last murder away. And make no mistake, the Brujah are fully aware of the fact that whatever they build is extraordinarily unlikely to last. They even have a little saying about it as well. I against my brother, my brothers and I against my cousins and I against strangers. And it is a remarkably apt proverb, for that is exactly how the modern Brujah act. As long as they have an external enemy, they're all love and puppies with one another. If they do not have an external enemy, they will go after the nearest equivalent. And if they can't even find that, well, they'll make do with friends and family if they must. As you can probably imagine, this kind of behavioral pattern is not exactly conducive towards building, well, anything long-term. And anything they construct, no matter how perfect or idyllic in accordance with their ideals, it will simply never last, because they will inevitably turn upon it. But still, many Brujah still profess to believe in various ideas or ideologies, socialism, fascism or anarchism, amongst many other isms as well, and various smaller or larger deviations and variations upon those isms. The question then is why? Why do they even bother? Why do they bother trying to build anything if they know they will always tear it down? Well, I believe the answer is in part ego. If the Brujah were to stop and truly recognize the fact that they are, at the end of the day, mere slaves to their own instinctual need to resist anything and everything, then that would mean that they were bound by the most inescapable status quo ever. Because the need to resist is as fundamental to their being and very nature as the urge to feed. It is, quite simply, not something they are able to fight. And so instead, they trick themselves and attempt to trick others into believing that they aren't doing this because they must resist the status quo. They're not doing this because they have to. They choose to do this. They take up the mantle of socialism and fight for the proletariat, the workers. They take up the mantle of fascism and fight for a state, for a unified goal, a group. They take on these various overriding philosophies because it is an excuse. It is something else that they can blame for their need to rebel against society. Something that is not their very own blood and being. I also suspect that there is an element of shame interwoven in it all. Because the Brujah know what they once were, or at the very least what they were once capable of being. Because the Brujah were not always so self-destructive. Once, they held the beast in check, with chains of logic, philosophy, and reason. The original Brujah aspired towards the Olympian ideal of a perfect mind in a perfect body housing a perfect spirit. Blessed with the unique possibilities that immortality gave them, they dedicated themselves to forging their minds and their bodies, becoming both scholars and warriors all at once. They created what many Brujah refer to now as a paradise in ancient Carthage. Some would tell you that it was a perfect city, where mortals and immortals lived side by side in harmony. So great and perfect was the city that some even refer to it as the third city, a rival to the first city created by Cain himself, and the second, created after the Great Flood by the antediluvians. In Carthage, the Brujah reached heights of perfection never seen before or since. There was no discipline beyond them, martial or learned. They were the masters of it all, and the clan stood at the very precipice of fulfilling the impossible goal of true perfection. But then it was all destroyed by the jealousy of others. An alliance of other vampire clans led by the Venture and aided by traitors from within Carthage. The might of Rome was roused against Carthage, and the city was destroyed during the Third Punic War, ending forever the great dream of Carthage. And even to this very day, the progenitor of the Brujah clan, Troil, sleeps beneath the salted sands of Carthage, dreaming forevermore about the lost perfection of the third city. Or at least, that is the recollection of some. Others would hold forth a very different version of the perfect city. Some would say that far from being a paradise, it was a blood-stained nightmare, where demon worshippers roamed the streets at night, stealing children away from their parents and sacrificing them in abhorrent rituals, all with the full knowledge and blessing of Troil, the founder of the Brujah. They would also tell you that Troil does not sleep alone underneath Carthage. They would tell you that he or she, for Troil's gender is somewhat ambiguous, sleeps interlocked in an eternal lover's embrace with Moloch, one of the founders of the Bali bloodline, an infamous cabal of demon worshippers. And at least according to some of the interpretations we have of ancient Carthaginian religion, some of their deities may very well be referred to as demons. Regardless of which version of the truth you would like to subscribe to, this was the end of the great Carthaginian experiment for the Brujah. They would, however, not give up their scholarly ways just yet, and even into the Dark Ages, 1,000 years after Christ, they were still considered to be warrior scholars. They were starting to tip a bit more towards their violence tendencies, but they were still instructing their new neonates, their recently embraced, in both the arts of warfare and in politics and philosophy with equal fervour. And the clan was viewed as one of the high clans of the age, continuing their rivalry and in many cases outright hostility towards the venture and the various descendants of ancient Rome, which had destroyed their once great dream of Carthage. However, their time as one of the great respected clans were drawing slowly but inexorably to a close. During the Victorian Age, the great split within the Brujah began to occur. There were still those within the clan who clung to the old ways, and maintained that they should remain a learned clan, of scholars, philosophers, as well as warriors, whilst many of the newly embraced had other ideas. They began slowly but surely to lean more and more away from the old and in their minds stagnant philosophies of the ancient world, and more towards the new and seductive ideologies of the waning years of the Victorian Age and the early days of the 20th century. These new, energetic and passionate movements were difficult to resist for many young Brujah. They saw in them something quite different from the stuffy teachings of their elders. The older generation always lived by shackling their frenzy. By controlling the beast within, they could channel their passions into more productive pursuits. This had been the way of the Brujah even before Carthage. It had been their way ever since they were created by the original creator of the Brujah, an antediluvian referred to as Ilis or Troil the Elder, not to be confused with the Troil in Carthage. At some unknown point in time, Troil diablerized his sire, stealing his power and becoming the progenitor of the modern-day Brujah Clan. But despite this betrayal, it was their twin nature that coloured the clan. Ilis was calm, measured, and in complete control of his emotions. Troil, however, was fiery, passionate, and would let himself get swept up in new philosophical ideas and martial pursuits. Before and after the fall of Carthage, these two sides had complemented one another. Passion provided the drive and interest required to study and learn, whilst control provided the discipline and force of will required to see each pursuit through until a successful end. The control also provided a shackle on the clan's more self-destructive tendencies. It allowed them to focus and channel them outwards towards more deserving groups. During the beginning of the 20th century, however, this control was starting to slip. The new ideas and ideologies fluttering around were far more passionate, far more fiery and interesting to the younger generation than the old and thoroughly studied, worn-out philosophies of their ancient forefathers. Many newly embraced found themselves chafing and struggling against the rigorous regime enforced upon them by their elders. Why should they be forced to study ancient, outdated sciences and thinking when the true blossoming of ideas and science was just outside the walls? What the world needed was not yet more fossils of a bygone age, tied forever to their dusty tomes, dreaming about long-lost glories. It needed action, revolution, passion, so that is what it would get. The split within the clan was as inevitable as it was unstoppable. and over the next century or so, the Brujah became progressively more radical and extreme, gravitating towards various ideas that promised to break the status quo in one way or another. The big thing at the time, of course, was socialism in all of its myriad aspects. Marxism, syndicalism, autonomism, Stalinism, Ba'athism, Trotskyism, fascism, etc., etc., etc. But without the discipline, and without the control of their ancient masters, the clan could not seem to carry through their great plans. This stage in Brujah history is defined by two great failures: the Anarch Free State and the Soviet Revolution. We have already touched briefly upon the Anarch Free State and how it spread across the west coast of the United States of America, and how it quite quickly degenerated into internal squabbles and street warfare. But it still did survive as a semi-consistent entity for almost 50 years, making it by far the longest existing experiment in anarchism anywhere in the world, albeit anarchism existing within an entirely different society. However, the Anarch Free States eventually collapsed in on themselves, under the weight of Camarilla influence and an invasion of the so-called Kuei Jin, Eastern vampires of a sort, but we'll get into that topic perhaps some other day. Suffice to say, the Anarch Free States did not stand the test of time, and even had it done so, its swift collapse into internal strife and street warfare would have made it into a failure regardless. So what about the second one, the Soviet Revolution? Now, don't get me wrong, the revolution itself was not, as far as we know at least, instigated by vampires themselves, but they did join up with the revolution, forming what was essentially a separate council of revolutionaries where they managed all kindred affairs within the USSR. This council was presumably, at least to a limited degree, a success. We don't know much about the particulars of the council or how it managed affairs within the USSR, but considering it was not destroyed by internal strife, it could perhaps be considered in some ways to be more of a success than the Anarch Free State. Of course, the Soviet Union never tried to be anarchism. It was a state, a government, and a nation, much like any other. However, one could still attribute a certain degree of success to the Soviet Vampire Council, and who knows how far they could have gotten if it were not for the awakening of the creature known as Baba Yaga. Precisely what she was, or who she once was, has been a subject of much debate, but what we know for sure is that she was a monstrously powerful vampire. Presumably a Methuselah, a fourth-generation monstrosity, that would have lived for thousands of years sleeping quietly in Russia until one night, in 1990, she awoke. And judging by what happened next, she was not a fan of the revolution and did not appreciate what it had done to her beloved motherland. And she shrouded the whole of Russia behind what became known as the Shadow Curtain, a supernatural phenomenon that prevented all means of arcane communication, spying, travel, or passage in and out of the area covered by it. This meant that no supernatural entity, kindred or otherwise, outside of Russia could enter Russia, and that no supernatural entity, kindred or otherwise, could leave the Baba Yaga's backyard. And now that she had complete control over whoever entered and left, the little grandmother set about the real business, transforming the Soviet Union into something more pleasing to her own ancient, half-rotted eyes. And there was absolutely nothing the Vampire Revolutionary Council or anyone else for that matter, could do to stop her. For 8 years she imposed a reign of unremittent terror upon all the kindred and probably the mortal population as well of Russia, until one day in 1998 she was killed by a being in many ways even more monstrous than her. A tale for another time, I think. And so the reign of the little grandmother, Baba Yaga, was lifted, and the world was reunited with Russia. But of the Vampire Revolutionary Council there was no trace. They had undoubtedly fallen afoul of the little grandmother, and considering her apparent displeasure at the Russia she found, I would imagine they were probably at the top of her list from the very get-go. And with these two great failures to define them, the modern-day Brujah are still struggling to find their place in the world. Many choose to join the Anarch movement, a grouping within vampire society that fights against the status quo and the powers of elders. They also, in many cases, resist traditions and the usual conventions of vampire society, though most of them do still respect the masquerade. Others might fall yet further and join the anti-tribu, a kind of extreme version of the clan, where all pretenses of learned scholarship or discipline are thrown aside for yet more degeneracy and extreme violence. They have gone as far as anyone has to fully embrace the beast within themselves. But there are still those who cling to the old ways as well. The so-called idealists, the intellectuals, the philosophers and the scholars of the clan. They are usually members of the older generations, the elders, and their opinions and ways have changed very little since their own embrace. Most, however, still straddle the mid-ground between these two extremes of the anti-tribu and the idealists. These normal clan members are more along the stereotypical modern image of the clan. Dangerous, quick to anger, and yet still with a certain philosophical streak to them, usually belonging to some form of ism or another, and would be more than happy to talk your ear off about the unjust treatment of society towards various groups of the oppressed and downtrodden. There are also other interesting formations like the Bayati Mushakis, an Islamic version of the Brujah. They are a fascinating little group that declared a holy war, a jihad, upon the Roman kindred who destroyed their great Carthaginian experiment, and will not stop until all of them have been suitably punished. They have been also a rather successful variant of the clan, forming their own power structure in Africa, and they are considerably more scholarly and disciplined than their more rambunctious Western cousins. There's a couple other ones as well, like the true Brujah, a very fascinating offspring that claims to be the true children of their antediluvian sire, rather than the bastard offspring of their fake sire. They are the exact opposite of the modern version of the clan. They are not passionate or quick to anger, they are instead measured, controlled, and almost entirely free of emotion. They also dabble in the control of time, of all things, making them a rather fascinating little bunch that I might want to cover in the future, so I'll leave it at that. And finally, at the end, I thought I'd add in a little bit of a why would you want to play these guys? In celebration of the upcoming Vampire the Masquerade 2, of course. The reason why this lore video exists in the first place, because I just couldn't resist giving a little bit of an arch spin on the lore, if you get my drift. So, why would you like to play the Brujah? And I've probably been mispronouncing it on occasion as well. Honest to God, it's got one of those fancy pronunciations, and I just tend to call them Brujah, honestly. It's easier. Not correct, but easier. Anywho, returning to the point, why would you want to play them? Well, why would you not want to play them? They're batshit insane extremists that will go to any length to fulfill their ideals and then to any length to burn it to the ground again. How is that not fascinating? Not to mention, they just look cool. They're badass rebels with, or occasionally without, a cause. And they do tend to go for a bit more of a direct solution. They are definitely the actiony pick, although if you want to roleplay them correctly, they can also be rather frustrating, since it is within their very base being to actively resist any and all form of authority, even something relatively banal, like, say for example, that they are given a quest, to add in a little bit of RPG terminology to this. A Brujah might see that as an order, and so feel like he almost has to disobey, or at the very least, misunderstand it just a little bit, you know? Hell, I seem to recall that there was even a penalty to your dice if you didn't find some way to break or at least creatively interpret instructions and orders you were given. And as you can probably imagine, whilst that might make for a very fun role-playing experience on occasion, it can also make for a rather frustrating experience for those who have to try and, cooperate with you. And remember, it's not like you have to be an anarchist or a communist or some such nonsense. You can pick pretty much any kind of ideology and simply just push it to its extreme. For example, you could play a hardcore religious zealot Christian, or a proper lunatic environmentalist. Hell, maybe your particular clan member is a fond supporter of Scientology. You can pick practically anything, as long as it's trying to break down the reigning status quo in some way, shape or form, you can play it. And let's be honest, our current society is relatively free and acceptive of essentially anything, so as long as you play something batshit and extreme, you're in business. And of course, you could also play a traditionalist. Now, personally, I much prefer that version of the clan. The idea of these warrior scholars always wrestling with and controlling their inner urges and desire, shackling the beast with logic and philosophy and so on, that sounds really, really cool. Anywho, I'll wrap it up there. So, what do you guys think? Should I make some more of this stuff? Did you enjoy it? Was it good? Perhaps it isn't my forte, perhaps it was terrible. Who knows? I'm certainly not as much of an expert on the world of darkness as I am 40k, by no stretch of the imagination, but I do have a passing interest and knowledge, and I think I did alright. I do believe that maybe I was a tad, unfair towards the clan, a little bit too dark, but honestly, I really do view this clan as one that has somewhat fallen from grace. I see their current position within society as constantly struggling against something, constantly having to fight against some form of status quo or oppression in any shape or form, even going so far as to degenerating within the very anarchist free states that they created, as a real degeneration, as a step backward from their once quite utopian ideals. I mean, I view this in relative terms to what they once had, when they were warrior scholars, when they were in control of their passions and their humours. I don't know, perhaps one might argue that they are freer now, more natural, more in tune with their senses and so on, but I can't help but see them as victims of their nature, as tragic victims indeed, rather than really an empowered faction, if I can put it like that. Anywho, please do let me know what you think, and until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. And until then, have a good day. Or perhaps, considering the subject material, I should say, have a good night.